I'm G.A. Sola. Hello. Regardless of what some people like to think nowadays, racism, by its core definition, is discrimination and/or prejudice against people based on their race. Well, in all fairness, some racists don't consider those people to be people in the first place, but it's definitely not whatever you decide it means based on the circumstances. South Africa, just like any other country with diversity, is no exception to this phenomenon. But even if there was no diversity in the country, people would find something else to hate each other about and discriminate based on that. Why? Because this is planet Earth, and that's just how we do things. In this first installment of my multi-part series on racism in South Africa, I'll specifically discuss the socio-economic factors that play a part in keeping racism alive in the country, focusing mostly on the tension between blacks and whites. Unlike Europe or the United States, where the majority of the population and ruling class are white and blacks are a minority, South Africa has the opposite, with blacks being the majority of the population and the ruling class. However, South Africa is still home to the largest white population in an African country, with about 9% of its population comprising of whites. And also, unlike the United States, where the minority blacks tend to not do so well on a socio-economic level, the minority whites in South Africa have an extraordinarily higher standard of living than the black majority. This, among other things, earns South Africa the title of the most unequal country on the planet on a socio-economic level. Now, I'm not South African, and I'm usually quick to correct people who think that I am, but I've lived in this democracy nearly my entire life, allowing me to well understand the situation. And from the perspective of most black South Africans, history is remembered as a bunch of white guys that show up from out of nowhere and try to claim a land that already belonged to someone else. And after centuries of wars, fighting, massacres, and other bullcrap that most people don't care to read about, they all found themselves in everybody's favorite part of the story: apartheid. A social regime of, I should say, attempted segregation of the races, institutionalized by the minority whites of, back then, less than 20% of the population. Most people don't even really know the details of apartheid, but all they do know, and all that really matters to them, is that the darker your skin was, the worse it was for you. Neither do most people know about how apartheid ended or how democracy began, but throw in names like Nelson Mandela and Robben Island, and things become slightly clearer for them. So in essence, black South Africans remember the past as white people dominating and mistreating black people, and do everything they can to not have anything like that happen ever again. To them. A large number of the conservative Afrikaner whites, who make up the majority of white people in South Africa, remember history with a different sentiment. Their focus begins with the time of the Voortrekkers, who scoured the land and survived every conflict, whether it be with Africans or the British, of whom they don't have very good sentiments due to a number of reasons. Afrikaners see South Africa as a country that they made great through civilization and modernization, and see apartheid less as a form of oppression for other races and more as a way of survival for their own race as Afrikaners, and, whether they like to admit it or not, their dominance over the other races. Because it was their firm belief that they were the only ones with the know-how on how to keep the country great by keeping it segregated.
The merit of the National Party lies in the fact that it has been able to hold this Fort South Africa for 26 years in the face of all these difficulties.
However, many Afrikaners and other whites realized that this system was self-centered and that it only catered for one particular race, their own. And many Afrikaners were actually instrumental in ending apartheid in the first place.
White South Africans are flocking to the polls today in one of the country's most historic referendums.
While the other Afrikaners saw the abolition of apartheid as betrayal, that they now had to consider themselves equal to those that they considered subhuman in the past.
A certain amount of people which wants to create a nation of unity. And then there's us, the Boers. We don't take part in this, and we're not going to.
However, many of their fears of the country ultimately going into chaos came true when the ANC government took power. After 1994, despite the ANC government's plans and promises to the South African people, particularly the black people, the so-called Rainbow Nation went down the toilet fast and you can say, "Help, I've been shot and I'm unemployed." And in the midst of the skyrocketing crime, poverty, unemployment, and infrastructural deterioration, all due to ANC incompetence, it became an unequivocal fact and quite obvious to the masses and economists that the people suffered these things at a disproportionate rate when it came to race. And here's why. Now, while it is true that the National Party during apartheid intentionally kept education for Africans on a low level, Out of the fear that too much education would lead to insurrection, the primary focus of the system was to keep the races segregated in order to create a white utopia, where white South Africans enjoyed extraordinary opportunities for prosperity. This was the primary cause for the unbelievably disproportionate statistics of unemployment, poverty, and overall livelihood between the races. These beneficiaries of the apartheid system enjoyed greater wealth, successful businesses, and an overall better standard of living than their black counterparts.
Well, I think that, we have so much space as white people. We have benefited hugely, and we still benefit every day from apartheid. It's nonsense to say we don't.
However, here I speak of the beneficiaries of the apartheid system, as South Africa saw an unprecedented increase in the number of white poverty and unemployment. Most of this was due to new laws in favor of affirmative action, such as BEE, Black Economic Empowerment, which is the encouragement or placement of previously disadvantaged black people in the workforce. The failures of BEE have caused a number of problems not only for white South Africans, but for black South Africans themselves. Firstly, when BEE was implemented in 2005, only a select few black individuals who met a certain criteria qualified for BEE, which led to the formation of broad-based black economic empowerment. This has led to a number of problems, such as some qualified white people being replaced by unqualified black people, because in this system, one's race or gender is of greater value in the workforce than one's qualifications.
But we can also not deny the fact that very many of these problems are service delivery, maintenance problems due to cadre deployment, affirmative action. Because people have been put into positions that they are not qualified to do, and the country is falling apart.
Not to say that there are no qualified black South Africans, but that their qualifications are not where the priorities lie. This has been greatly linked to the failing South African economy as well. Now, about these unemployed white folk living in poverty, a number of outside entities have taken notice of the issue. Today, there are said to be about 80 squatter camps inhabited only by white people. However, many hesitate to call these places squatter camps, because when compared to the squatter camps inhabited by black people, they differ greatly, such as the white squatter camps having running water and better housing than the black squatter camps. But even so, these are not places in which anyone would want to live. Now, some biased or misinformed people will exaggerate these numbers, especially those who adhere to the white genocide conspiracy theories, on which I intend on discussing in a later video, claiming that the majority of white people live in unemployment and poverty in South Africa.
I'm not a racist, but the blacks comes first, and then the whites. And even highly qualified whites don't even get a position in South Africa.
Oh, is that so?
I've done nursing, the 2-year courses, but I still can't find even just any other job, even without the one that I have qualifications for.
Nearly 400,000 white South Africans live in poverty in South Africa. Although this is sad and a pretty large number, one must remember that this is 400,000 out of 4.6 million white South Africans in the country.
And formerly comfortable Afrikaners see themselves as victims of reverse apartheid. In spite of this, white South Africans still control most of the country's economy.
Complaining about your circumstances is not the issue. The problem is when people overgeneralize white poverty to the point where it distorts the reality of the situation. And also remember that we're sitting at about 49.2% of the adult South African population living below the upper bound poverty line, which is the number of adults with an income of less than 1,183 Rand per month. Now put that into perspective, and you have more than 33 million black South Africans living under poverty, while you have nearly 400,000 white South Africans living under poverty. But before you think that that's because they're a minority and that the blacks are a majority, let me put that into percentages. For the blacks, that's about 61% of the black population living in poverty, while only about 8% of the white population in South Africa are living in poverty. And for those who are employed, a number of studies have already shown that the average lifetime work-related earnings for whites are much higher than for other groups. One study showed that the earnings peak at 300,000 Rand a year on average for white people, while for Africans it peaked at 70,000 Rand. Now, there are a number of well-defined reasons for these disproportionate numbers that I discussed in part 2 of this series. These issues stem not only from socioeconomic but also cultural causes. I highly encourage you to watch that to have a better understanding of the situation. But now the question of how these statistics relate to the matter of racism in South African society remains. In essence, even if you've never heard of these specific numbers, by simply clearly having a look around on the surface, especially in provinces such as Gauteng, one can clearly see the disproportionate numbers in class in South African society. And this causes tension. One side perceives the other side to be privileged while they're being neglected, while the other side has the same perception of the other side. In other words, the underprivileged whites think that the blacks are being privileged because of BEE, and the underprivileged blacks think that the whites have been privileged because of apartheid. While both perceptions bear truth to a certain extent, many tend to fall into the trap of thinking that this is true for everyone of the other race. And it is out of this amalgamation of frustration and broken promises from a government that only pretends to care about its people, and the frustrations of a community that yearns for the good old days, that plays its part in forming the prejudice, the same prejudice in the very definition of racism. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. Socioeconomic issues alone are in no way the sole reason for the racism present in South African society today, but it definitely plays its part in the grand scheme of things. This series will dissect each facet of racism in South African society. Think of it what you will. I'm not going to preach that you shouldn't be a racist or anything. Thank you for watching. Keep a lookout for the other parts. I'm G.A. Sola. Goodbye.